This is SpaceTime, Series 29, Episode 2, for broadcast on the 5th of January 2026. Coming up on SpaceTime, Unraveling the Milky Way's mysterious history, how the Earth's mantle was able to lock away vast amounts of water during the early magma ocean, and we look back at how astronomy was set in stones. All that and more coming up on SpaceTime.
Welcome to SpaceTime with Stuart Gary.
A new study claims the Milky Way galaxy's bimodal stellar formation evolution may be the result of intergalactic gas, rather than bursts of star formation or collisions with other galaxies. The findings, reported in the monthly notices of the Royal Astronomical Society, explores the origins of a puzzling feature of the Milky Way galaxy, the presence of two distinct groups of stars with different chemical compositions, a feature known as chemical bimodality. You see, when scientists study stars near the Sun, they find two main types based on their chemical makeup, specifically the amounts of iron and magnesium they contain. And these two groups form separate sequences in a chemical diagram, even though they overlap in metallicity, that is, how rich they are in heavy elements. Astronomers call all elements, other than hydrogen and helium, metals. This chemical bimodality in the Milky Way has long puzzled scientists. And this new study uses advanced computer simulations to recreate the formation of galaxies like the Milky Way in a virtual universe. The authors analysed 30 simulated galaxies, looking for clues about how these chemical sequences form. Understanding the chemical history of the Milky Way helps astronomers piece together how our galaxy formed and how others like it also came to be. That includes the Milky Way's sister galaxy M31 Andromeda, in which no bimodality has been detected. It also provides clues about the conditions of the early universe and the role of cosmic gas flows and galaxy mergers. The study's lead author, Matthew Orkney from the University of Barcelona, says the research shows that the Milky Way's chemical structure is not a universal blueprint, and that diversity is key to understanding galactic evolution. The study reveals that galaxies like our Milky Way can develop two distinct chemical sequences through various different sorts of mechanisms. In some cases, this bimodality rises from bursts of star formation, followed by periods of little activity, while in others it's the result of changes in the inflow of gas from a galaxy's surroundings. Now, contrary to previous assumptions, the Milky Way's cannibalization of a smaller galaxy, known as Gaia Sausage Enceladus, is not a necessary condition for this chemical pattern to emerge. Now, you probably haven't heard of the Gaia Sausage Enceladus galaxy before because it doesn't exist anymore. It was a dwarf galaxy that was merged into the Milky Way between 8 and 11 billion years ago. In fact, at least 8 globular clusters were added to the Milky Way's retinue, along with 50 billion solar masses worth of stars, gas and dark matter as a result of this merger, and it was the last major merger of the Milky Way. But in this new study, the simulations showed that metal-poor gas from the circumgalactic medium played a crucial role in forming the second sequence stars. The circumgalactic medium is a vast gaseous halo surrounding galaxies, acting as a sort of bridge between a galaxy's internal interstellar medium and the larger intergalactic medium around it. It extends from the galactic disk all the way out to the dark matter halo. It's a dynamic reservoir of gas and dust at various different temperatures and densities, ranging from hot ionized gas to cooler molecular clouds. And this provides fuel for new star formation and receiving enriched material from galactic outflows, playing a key role in regulating galactic growth and evolution through continuous feedback cycles. The authors found that the shape of these chemical sequences is closely linked to the Milky Way star formation history. And the study predicts that many other galaxies will also exhibit a similar diversity of chemical sequences. And ultimately, this will help astronomers further refine the physical evolutionary path of our own Milky Way galaxy. This is SpaceTime. Still to come, how the Earth's mantle was able to lock away vast amounts of water during the early magma ocean. And we look back at a study showing how astronomy is set in stones. All that and more still to come on SpaceTime. A new study has shown how much of Earth's water could have survived the planet's formation by being locked away in bridgmanite minerals deep in the Earth's mantle. The findings, reported in the journal Science, could reshape astronomy's understanding of water storage and distribution in the early ancient Earth. As it coalesced and formed out of the protoplanetary disk some 4.6 billion years ago, Earth was nothing like the gentle blue planet we see today. Frequent and violent celestial impacts accreted material onto the planet, and this included the cataclysmic Theia collision 4.5 billion years ago, during which time a planet the size of Mars slammed into the early proto-Earth, turning both bodies into a seething ocean of magma, in the process creating our moon. Now, this was an environment so extreme that liquid water simply couldn't exist, leaving the entire planet resembling an inferno. Now, since 70% of the Earth's surface is now covered with oceans, the mystery of how water survived and was preserved in this early superheated molten state has long been a subject of debate. The new study's lead author, Du Jiu from the Ganzhou Institute of Geochemistry, says the mineral bridgmanite was the key. It's the most abundant mineral inside the Earth's mantle, and its molecules could have acted as microscopic water containers, holding substantial amounts of water which could have effectively been locked away deep within the mantle as it crystallized from its molten state. Jiu says bridgmanite would have made it possible for the early Earth to retain a substantial amount of water in the mantle as the planet solidified. And this early retained water may have been critical for transforming Earth from a fiery inferno into the habitable world we enjoy today. Previous studies, which relied on relatively low temperature experimental conditions, suggested that bridgmanite had only limited water storage capability. So Du and colleagues wanted to test out that hypothesis. But they faced two major challenges. First, they needed to simulate the extreme conditions found at depths exceeding 660 kilometres below the surface in a laboratory. And secondly, they had to find some way to accurately detect water signals in bridgmanite samples, some of which would have been smaller than a tenth the width of a human hair, at concentrations as low as just a few hundred parts per million. The authors overcame these obstacles by building a diamond anvil cell experimental setup equipped with laser heating and high-temperature imaging. This allowed them to raise experimental temperatures dramatically to an extreme of around 4,100 degrees Celsius. And this successfully recreated deep mantle conditions and allowed precise measurements of equilibrium temperatures, laying the foundations for understanding temperature's role in how water is taken up by minerals. The authors used cryogenic three-dimensional electron diffraction and atom probe tomography to analyze water at the micro to nanometer scale, allowing them to visualize water distribution in tiny samples, confirming that it was structurally dissolved in bridgmanite. They found that bridgmanite's water locking capacity increases significantly with increases in temperature. This means that during planet Earth's hottest magma ocean phase, crystallizing bridgmanite could have retained far more water than previously thought, directly overturning that long-held view that the deep lower mantle was nearly dry. The authors then modelled the crystallization of the magma ocean. The simulation showed that bridgmanite's strong water-locking ability under high temperatures resulted in the planet's lower mantle becoming the largest water reservoir in the solid mantle after the magma ocean solidified. In fact, the models suggest its storage capacity could have been anywhere between 5 and 100 times greater than previous estimates. The total amount of water therefore retained in the early solid mantle could have equalled the volume of all today's oceans. And the authors go further. They point out that the deeply buried water could have acted as a sort of lubricant for Earth's massive geological engine. It lowered the melting point and viscosity of mantle rocks, thereby promoting internal circulation and plate motion and providing the planet with sustained evolutionary vitality. Over time, the sequestered water was gradually pumped back to the surface through magmatic activity, contributing to the formation of Earth's primordial atmosphere and oceans. This is SpaceTime. Still to come, we look back at a study showing how some of the earliest standing stones in Britain were constructed specifically with the movements of the sun and moon in mind. And later in the science report, a new study warns that sleep apnea could be linked to Parkinson's disease. All that and more still to come on SpaceTime. Just 10 years ago, a major breakthrough in archaeological astronomy was achieved when scientists from the Australian National University and the University of Adelaide were able to show for the very first time that the earliest standing stone monuments in Great Britain, the 5,000-year-old Great Circles, were constructed specifically in line with the movements of the Sun and Moon. The findings, published in the Journal of Archaeological Science Reports, used 2- and 3-dimensional techniques to construct quantitative tests of the patterns of alignment of the ancient standing stones. The study's lead author, Gail Higginbottom, says no one had ever previously been able to statistically determine that a single stone circle was constructed with astronomical phenomena in mind. She says up until then it was all just supposition. Examining the oldest Great Circle stones in Scotland, Callanish on the Isle of Lewis and Steness on the Isle of Orkney, both of which predate the more famous Stonehenge by some 500 years, Higginbottom and colleagues found a great concentration of alignments towards the Sun and Moon at different times of their cycles. And 2,000 years later, much simpler monuments were still being built in Scotland that had at least one of the same astronomical alignments as that found at the Great Circles. The stones, however, aren't just connected to the Sun and the Moon. The authors discovered a complex relationship between the alignment of the stones, the surrounding landscape and horizon, and the movements of the Sun and Moon across that landscape. Higginbottom says the research was final proof that ancient Britons connected the earth to the sky with their earlier standing stones, and that this practice continued along the same way for at least 2,000 years. The authors found that about half the sites were surrounded by one landscape pattern and the other half of sites were surrounded by the complete reverse. Higginbottom says these chosen surroundings would have influenced the way the Sun and Moon were seen, especially in the timing of their rising and setting at special times, like when the Moon appears at its most northerly position on the horizon, which only happens once every 18.6 years. The authors found that at half the sites, the northern horizon is relatively higher and closer than the southern horizon, and the summer solstice sun appears to rise out of the highest peak in the north. Meanwhile, at the other 50% of sites, the southern horizon is higher and closer than the northern, and the winter solstice sun appears to rise out of these highest horizons. Higginbottom says the findings show that these people chose to erect their great stones very precisely, both within the landscape and in relation to the astronomy they knew. She says it shows they invested a tremendous amount of effort to do the work. And that tells us about their strong connection with their environment and how important that must have been to them for their culture and for their culture's survival.
This is the first time that we've actually been able to confirm that individual circles have a complex array of orientations regarding different parts of the solar and lunar cycles. Part of the reason for that is that when people were looking at the stone circles previously, they used to look at just the orientations that they thought hit on the sun or the moon, and they ignored those that didn't. So even if they tried to do some kind of assessment on it, they weren't approaching it in a very fully sound manner. So now we can conclude that we've done that, and we've got excellent results where both the Circle of Callanish, which is on the west coast on the Isle of Lewis of Scotland, and Orkney, the stone circle there, Steness, most certainly say 97.7% sure that they are set up in regards to astronomical phenomena.
How did you do the research?
So we had two approaches. The first one was we had to do a very specific statistical test that was developed by my colleague Roger Clay. How much in depth would you like me to go into that?
We're dealing with something. We're dealing with something that was 5,000 years ago when these things were first set up. So obviously the sky was different then. You had to account for all that, and also the landscape. Although the hills were there, nevertheless the landscape may have appeared different in terms of vegetation and that sort of thing. All these sort of things, all these environmental factors need to be considered as well. So what did you basically do?
Yes. So first, of course, we did run our programs to ensure that we knew exactly where the sun and the moon were rising and setting at the time that these stones have been shown to be erected, as scientific dating has shown for them to be erected. And then on top of that, we looked at or examined the possibility of the vegetation cover in the areas. And basically, certainly for Western Scotland, it was shown that there was either very, very open, kind of like a scrubland equivalent, and partial, very, very open, basically, particularly on Western Lewis, very, very open, and Western Scotland generally. And on Orkney, during that time, it would have been much the same. So when there were trees, it was very open, or sometimes just open patches in these two particular areas. And we've looked at other areas individually.
Is it difficult to put a date on these things? Can't use carbon dating for stone, I guess. So you're looking at something which is buried somewhere near it, I guess. That is carbon, or how did you do it?
So, well, actually, I didn't do it, but other people. So, for example, a gentleman by the name of Patrick Ashmore did excavation of Callanish, and they looked at the different times that specific stones were erected or not, and other activities around the stone circle. So they confirmed that the different kinds of dating you do are through burnt material, so for example wood or bone, and both have been found at Stennis and Callanish.
That gave scientists a pretty good idea of when these things were erected. I guess the fact that we're seeing these sorts of stone circles throughout what we now call the British Isles, but also we've seen them in parts of Europe as well. Are we looking at, and I know this isn't your specific area of expertise, but are we looking at something which was a fairly, literally a broad church, I guess, something that was practiced over a wide area?
Certainly standing stone monuments were placed over a wide area, right from Ireland until Eastern Europe and beyond, in fact. India, China, other places, right through at slightly different times. Standing stone circles, though, are certainly not as prevalent as perhaps stone rows or single standing stones. And stone circles are most prevalent in the British Isles, Western Europe, Spain, Portugal, a few in Scandinavia, no firm confirmed circles in Germany, but lots of standing stones. The circles tend to be part of a burial monument as opposed to a separate standing stone circle. But there are great patches through the European continent where people chose to continue building their monuments in wood and earth. So there's a very interesting division there between the groups of people who adopted the megalithic culture and those who didn't. And we're actually starting to look into that now.
Does it go with trade?
Interesting question. I think that in the very, very early days of when, for example, agriculture was first coming in through Europe, I think that is a possibility. I think it would have been trade, but also the movement of peoples, because sometimes people brought this different and the new, as it's called the Neolithic, sort of agriculture and the new Stone Age coming through parts of Europe, such as southeastern Europe and moving through Central Europe. And other times it was trade, so it would be a combination. Nothing simple, I'm afraid.
Is it just for agricultural purposes, or is there more to it than that? All we really have are the stones. There's no written work associated with this. What do you surmise from what you've done?
I think there are two very important things going on. They're both tightly entwined, and that is, I think that the standing stones are in places that people already knew about. But at these places, and I'll explain this because it's something that we haven't really touched on, is that the standing stones in Britain at least are in very specific places we've discovered which allow you to view the sun and the moon from very specific perspectives. So for instance, you can at half the site see one perspective, and loosely speaking, and at the other half of the site's another perspective. And so the first perspective is that when you're standing at your stone circle, that you will have the northern horizon very high and quite close to you relatively. The south will be very distant and low compared to the north. The summer solstice sun will rise out of the highest peak in the northeast out of this range or hillock or mountain, depending on the landscape, and set in the high mountain in the northwest. If you turn south, the winter solstice sun will rise and set out of little hills, or they could be mountains at a great distance, from the southeast and set into a hill in the southwest, and often it will travel over water to do so. And so you have all these amazing setups that they've done that can only be viewed at these specific locations. And what we discovered that for scores of sites in Western Scotland, which are Bronze Age, about 1500 BC, so that's about 3,500 years ago. And we now know those two great circles we talked about at the beginning have the same setup. And to get back to your question, therefore, they know about these places already, so I don't think that they're already agricultural, because as soon as they built standing stones, they already knew about those places before agriculture had come. Agriculture was coming into that area at the same time. They were mainly herders, but they did do some agriculture, but it wasn't as big as it was down south, so to speak. Added to that, then, I think that what they've done is actually represent their cosmological understanding of the universe. And through these standing stones and how they see the sunrise and set out of those very special setups that they've done, they're showing themselves, and it represents the cycle that they understand that the universe works as a cycle, and that the cycle themselves work as opposition. So you've got day and night, the sun rising in the north, for example, at summer solstice, the full moon that can only rise in the south at the summer solstice if it's at its most extreme rising and setting point, which only occurs every 18.6 years, and all these kind of complicated things go on. Enough information, in fact, that they could even, if they wanted to, predict eclipses if they knew about that sort of thing.
It's a very detailed culture, isn't it?
It is very detailed and very complex, and it's also linked to the cult of the dead, because you will always find the dead associated with standing stones.
That was my next question. Are there burial sites nearby? So I guess you've just answered that.
Yes, and in very, very different ways. When they're associated directly with the standing stones, they're very frequently cremated dead, and you get parts of people's bodies placed, cremated bones that is, placed in the socket of the standing stone. So they put them in before they put the people in, or parts of them, before they put the standing stone there. And then they may also put a cremated burial inside a jar and bury that next to the standing stone. Or it may in fact be next to where they bury the cremation in a stone slab coffin underneath the ground and put a nice stone monument over that, a ray of a cairn, we call it. So the dead are associated in many different ways with these standing stones, and Stonehenge itself is known to have many, many dead associated with it.
With some standing stones, I believe there's also evidence of festivals associated with that, animal bones, things like that.
Oh, yes, we've got something very similar also happened at Stennis. So certainly nearby there may have actually been major festivals occurring, whether that's in association with the dead or not as well, I'm unsure, but they've also found bones that are associated with specific seasons in relation to the areas near Stonehenge. And they've decided they may well have been the special gathering times that people met together for either trade or other kinds of connections between groups across a large area.
That's Dr. Gail Higginbottom from the Australian National University and the University of Adelaide. And this is SpaceTime. And time now to take a brief look at some of the other stories making news in science this week with the Science Report. New research has found that obstructive sleep apnea, a condition in which some people briefly stop breathing during sleep, may increase your risk of developing Parkinson's disease. The findings, reported in the Journal of the American Medical Association, are based on research involving the health records of 11 million people. The authors found that those who had been diagnosed with obstructive sleep apnea had a small increase in their risk of Parkinson's disease, around 1.6 extra cases per 1,000 people. The study also found that treating sleep apnea early using a breathing device called CPAP could reduce that risk. A new analysis has found that 1 in 7 deep-water sharks and rays are now threatened with extinction. The findings, reported in the journal Science, show the biggest threat coming from overfishing. Scientists say that deep-water sharks and rays, species that spend most of their life at depths greater than 200 metres, are the most sensitive marine vertebrates to overexploitation because of their long lifespans and low reproductive rates. A new study has shown that teenage girls are clocking close to 6 hours a day on their smartphones. The findings, reported in the Journal of the Archives of Disease in Childhood, say that a large proportion of these kids are likely addicted to social media. The authors recruited 1,164 15 and 16-year-old girls from Finland and collected data on their daily smartphone use. They looked at how frequently they were picking up their phones and found the vast majority were looking at their smartphones at least 356 times every day. Using measurements of addiction, anxiety and body separation, the authors found 17% of teens were possibly addicted to social media, and over a third scored above the potential cutoff for potential anxiety disorder. Daily time spent on social media was associated with a lower grade point average, higher social media addiction scores, higher levels of anxiety, poorer body image, poorer health, lower mood, more tiredness, and greater feelings of loneliness. To quote the immortal Dr. Sheldon Cooper, there is absolutely no scientific evidence to support clairvoyance of any kind. That means that fortune-telling is a fraud, profession is a swindle, and its livelihood is dependent on the gullibility of stupid people. To help underline those wise words, a bunch of psychics have been put to the test, and again, they've failed miserably. This latest study, reported in the journal Brain and Cognition, was a double-blind test to determine a psychic's ability to determine the cause of death of a group of subjects. The skeptic's Tim Mendham says not only did the mediums perform worse than they would have by simple random chance, but non-psychics brought in as a control group who claimed no special spiritual, psychic or supernatural powers actually did better than the psychics.
There's been a lot of tests done over the years, over the last 100 years, of people with supposed psychic skills, etc., from the old Xena cards, with the cross and the circle and the square and that sort of stuff to try and say which card is which. A big part of the psychic movement is obviously contacting the dead, which has been described as grief vampirism, to actually sort of pick up people who are quite distraught at having lost a relative, anyone, and then after I can contact them and say, Uncle Harry's very happy up here and he still loves you. Therefore, some people tried to put some of this to the test. And how do you prove they're not contacting the dead, or how do you prove they are? It's only a fairly small number of mediums. This was in the United States, gathered a small number of mediums, and they were shown 180 photographs of people who had died. But the photographs were taken up several years before they died, and the task they gave these mediums was to determine the cause of death, choosing among options such as gunshot, heart attack or car accident, so fairly traumatic events, not just sort of dying of old age. And the group had to sort of decide how they died. And if they're contacting the people after death, they should be able to say, I died in the car crash, or they should have known. They also had a group of ordinary people, like non-mediums, people who don't claim any psychic ability, to do the same test to see how they, as a control, see how they would work out. And as it worked out, it showed that when the ordinary people were looking at the photographs, their heart rate was fairly normal. When the mediums were looking at the photographs, their heart rate shot up. They're under stress. Put it this way, they didn't do well. The mediums, in fact, they did rather poorly. The control group did better at choosing the reason for death than the mediums did. Not a lot. They were about 4% higher, and the mediums scored 0.2% lower than chance predictions, which means they're pretty much on chance, which means they're pretty much guesswork. So these sort of tests, these quantitative tests, are very worthwhile doing, to have a look at sort of to see if people can actually do what they claim they can do. Like the skeptics offer $100,000 to anyone who can prove what they claim they can do under such scientific conditions. With these tests, of course, it's a bit imperfect. It's a small number of mediums, but this was pretty straightforward, and these people said that they could do it. They make their living out of doing this, so it's a pretty important issue. The medium said they reported feeling the pain of the individuals, but they were unable to pinpoint the exact causes, which is, I think there's a technical term for this, and it starts with B, has S in it as well, because these are people who make their living by contacting the dead and passing on the information to their relatives and saying, I've got Uncle Harry on the line. He says he still loves you. Watch out for that car. Watch out for this, that, and the other. So they can give specific information. Never specific enough to show that where the money is buried, but specific information enough from the dead person, but they can't say how the person died. In fact, they often claim that they were sick, they had a bad problem, they had a health issue, they had lung issues, whatever.
Yeah, when you talk, got a health problem at some stage.
Everyone's got a health problem. Everyone's got a back problem, by the way. But when they are in a medium-client situation, they can claim all sorts of things about health. But when they put down to this, they're showing a photo of something which they claim to be able to contact, enough to know that they're in pain, they can't say how they died. And I would suggest that me, personally, I'm a bit on the nasty side of the skeptics. I would say most people who are claiming they can talk to the dead are actually not, and perhaps know they're not. Others might think they are.
I think the term is con artists.
Yeah, and grifters.
That's the skeptic's Tim Mendham, and this is Space Time. And that's the show for now. SpaceTime is available every Monday, Wednesday and Friday through Bytes.com, SoundCloud, YouTube, your favourite podcast download provider, and from spacetimewithstuartgary.com. SpaceTime's also broadcast through the National Science Foundation on Science Zone Radio and on both iHeartRadio and TuneIn Radio. And you can help to support our show by visiting the SpaceTime store for a range of promotional merchandising goodies, or by becoming a SpaceTime patron, which gives you access to triple episode commercial-free versions of the show, as well as lots of bonus audio content which doesn't go to air, access to our exclusive Facebook group, and other rewards. Just go to spacetimewithstuartgary.com for full details.
You've been listening to SpaceTime with Stuart Gary. This has been another quality podcast production from Bytes.com.